London, mid-18th century. The Thames claimed hundreds of lives. 1 in 5 deaths in the city was from drowning. There was no salvation, only despair. But one day, a few compassionate individuals achieved the impossible. They united. They formed a society dedicated to rescuing victims from watery graves. What began as a local initiative blossomed into a global movement, a model of humanism and organization. And this movement, 150 years later, echoed in the poetry of Alexander Bloch, becoming a symbol of hope and the struggle for life. We tend to believe that breakthroughs are born in the quiet of laboratories, from the brilliant insights of solitary geniuses. That progress is a flash of light piercing the darkness of ignorance. This is a myth. History teaches otherwise. True discoveries, fundamental shifts, they are almost always the fruit of chaos, despair, and collective effort. They are born from acute necessity, from countless failures and endless searching, not from abstract thought. They are an answer to the world's pain. In the 18th century, human life was considered virtually worthless. Most births inevitably ended in infant death. Every scratch could lead to infection, every bruise to suppuration, every cough to a final breath. Pain relief did not exist. Surgery was torture, performed by uneducated barbers whose instruments were filthy and knowledge primitive. Doctors were guided by ancient dogmas, borrowed from texts written a millennium and a half earlier. Bloodletting was a panacea for everything. Wounds were cauterized with hot iron or doused with boiling oil to kill infection, though they had no understanding of it whatsoever. Suppuration was considered laudable puss, a sign of cleansing, not a mortal threat. Patients died from shock, pain, and sepsis, while doctors sagely debated the balance of bodily fluids. This world was a realm of pain and ignorance, where suffering was the norm and death an inevitable end. No one believed these torments could be alleviated. No one dared challenge the deeply ingrained traditions. A lack of knowledge, superstitions, and fear of the new created an impenetrable wall between pain and hope. But even this impenetrable wall, built by fear and ignorance, could be breached not by abstract ideas, but by personal agonizing experience. One such experience belonged to a young doctor whose education was no different from thousands of others. He learned medicine from the same ancient treatises as everyone else. His hands became accustomed to the sight of blood and pus in London's overcrowded hospitals. There, patients' screams were background noise, and agony was commonplace. He was not a lone genius who appeared out of nowhere with ready-made solutions. He was part of the system. And it was within this system, observing thousands of deaths, that he began to doubt. Not abstractly, not from an intellectual epiphany, but from horrifying specifics. Why did those who were treated die? Why did the methods they were taught not work? He saw patients whose wounds were cauterized with hot iron writhe in pain, then fade away. He saw those saved by bloodletting weaken and perish. He saw laudable pus bring infection and death instead of cleansing. Every day he faced a chasm between dogma and reality, between what he was taught and what happened before his eyes. This chasm grew. It became unbearable, and it pushed him to the most terrifying conclusion for that era. What they were doing was not helping. It was killing. This horror, this whisper of doubt, born within the walls of the hospital, became his personal revolution. This horror, this whisper of doubt, born within the walls of the hospital, became his personal revolution. But a revolution is not without action. The young doctor, named Joseph Lister, did not just doubt, he sought answers. He sought any way to halt the relentless march of death. Every day he saw the same thing, open fractures, which almost always meant bone decay, amputation, and agonizing death. In the 18th century, such a fracture was a death sentence. 100% of cases ended fatally. Wounds, with any manipulation, with even the most careful touch, turned into breeding grounds for infection. Hospitals were factories of death. The air within them was permeated with miasma, the smell of pus and decomposition. Instruments were covered with blood from previous operations. Surgeons' hands, having just dissected a corpse, would touch a living patient, transferring invisible death. No one saw the connection. No one understood that the invisible was killing. Lister knew that his teacher's methods didn't work. He saw patients who were treated according to all the rules die. One day, in 1865, a boy named James Green-Lees was brought to the Glasgow hospital where Lister worked. He had a severe open fracture of the tibia. The bone had pierced the skin, exposing itself to the air. It was a death sentence. Everything he knew didn't work. All the ointments and poultices, everything called treatment, only hastened death. That day, as if having exhausted all options, as if the very oil of traditional medicine had run out, he decided on a desperate step. He recalled the works of Louis Pasteur, his theory of invisible microbes causing fermentation and putrefaction, and how carbolic acid was used to disinfect sewage in Carlisle, preventing stench and disease. If it killed what caused putrefaction outside the body, why not try it inside? It was a crazy thought. No one had ever applied such an aggressive substance to living tissues. The acid could burn, maim, kill. The risk was enormous, but the choice was between certain death and a tiny, almost unthinkable chance. Lister took a bottle of carbolic acid. Carefully, drop by drop, he began to irrigate the boy's open wound with it. First, he cleaned the skin around it, then the fracture itself, thoroughly irrigating the exposed bone. The patient screamed in pain. The acid burned. But Lister continued, methodically, thoroughly. Then he applied a dressing, consisting of layers of gauze soaked in the same acid, to create a barrier protecting the wound from air and miasma, or rather, from invisible killers. The days dragged painfully slowly. Every morning Lister came to the boy's bedside, expecting to see the usual picture: suppuration, stench, fever, amputation. But it didn't happen. The wound remained clean. There was no pus. The inflammation subsided. After several weeks, to the amazement of all who witnessed it, the boy began to recover. His wound healed. He survived. Not just survived, he recovered, avoiding amputation. It was a miracle. It was the first step, a step that forever changed the course of medicine, giving hope to millions. He proved invisible enemies can be defeated. One saved boy meant nothing. It could have been a coincidence, a miracle, a fluke. Lister understood, to revolutionize the world of medicine, it required not a miracle, but irrefutable evidence. He didn't stop. He began to apply his method again and again. Each time he meticulously recorded the smallest details: the condition of the wound before treatment, the concentration of the solution, the exposure time, the patient's reaction. He observed. He compared. He saw how wounds that previously inevitably festered remained clean, how amputations, which had become the usual outcome, now bypassed his patients. This was not abstract insight, but persistent, methodical work, based on observation and verification. It was pure empiricism. Carbolic acid was effective, but aggressive. It irritated the skin, caused burns, and inflicted pain. Lister did not ignore these problems. He learned from each case. He experimented with different concentrations, seeking ways to soften its action without losing its potency. He tried new dressings soaked in the solution to provide continuous protection. He invented special plasters based on carbolic acid that adhered tightly to the wound, protecting it from the external environment and invisible killers. He even created a spray device that, during operations, filled the operating room air with tiny particles of acid, attempting to disinfect the very space where death had reigned. This was not just treatment, it was a system born from thousands of observations and a striving for perfection. His discoveries were too important to keep to himself. In 1867, Joseph Lister published his results in a series of articles in The Lancet. He didn't write in Latin, the language of scholars. He wrote in English, the language of practicing doctors. His style was clear, concrete, devoid of grandiloquence. He didn't theorize, he described facts. I used this. Here's what happened. Here's how you can repeat it. He explained Pasteur's theory, but his main emphasis was on practical application. He gave clear instructions, like a roadmap for those who face death every day. He didn't just share knowledge, he provided a tool. He didn't wait for them to come to him. He traveled to hospitals himself, demonstrating his methods and training surgeons. He showed them clean wounds, living patients who would have been doomed before. He patiently answered their questions and dispelled their doubts. He knew his ideas would face resistance because they shattered the established order and demanded changing habits ingrained over decades. But he persisted. He believed in his observations. He believed in the evidence. He believed in life. And this faith, supported by irrefutable facts, was his main weapon. His discoveries, published in The Lancet, descended upon the medical world not as a salvation, but as an affront. For centuries, doctors had believed in miasma, infectious vapors emanating from decaying matter. They saw the cause of diseases in bad air, not in invisible creatures. It was a convenient, understandable theory. Lister, however, proposed something invisible, intangible, requiring them to believe in what they could neither see nor touch. It was too radical. For many influential figures in medical academies and royal colleges of physicians, the very idea of invisible microbes causing diseases was ludicrous. The use of carbolic acid caused horror. Patients screamed in pain during treatment, and it was visible to everyone. For traditional surgeons accustomed to pus as a laudable phenomenon, the burning from the acid was proof of its destructive power, not its saving action. "You are burning your patients!" Opponents cried, pointing to the burns and skin irritation as irrefutable evidence of his barbarism. Many influential figures in medical academies and royal colleges of physicians saw him as an upstart. The young Scot dared to challenge their centuries-old traditions, their authority, their reputations. To admit Lister's correctness would mean admitting that all their previous methods were mistaken, that they themselves were responsible for thousands upon thousands of deaths. Such an admission was unthinkable. It was a blow to the foundations of their world. His articles were rejected, his lectures booed. Colleagues turned away. He was called a charlatan, a madman, a murderer. Doctors who dared to apply his methods faced ridicule and professional ostracism. But through this chorus of indignation, the voices of a few broke through, those who could not ignore the obvious. These were not only young and ambitious doctors. Among them were experienced surgeons, weary of their helplessness in the face of death. They saw how, in Lister's operating rooms, where infection once reigned, wounds now healed without suppuration. They saw how entire wards, which had previously been mere antechambers to the morgue, now filled with recovering patients. These individuals, despite the risk of being rejected by their own community, began to apply his methods. Among his few yet influential supporters were hospital directors and renowned professors who, perhaps initially skeptical of Lister, eventually sided with him after encountering his irrefutable results. They provided him with platforms for speaking, defended him from press attacks, and ensured he could continue his research. Their support was not merely an act of benevolence, it was an act of enlightenment. They understood that what was at stake was not ego, but the future of humanity. Their support was important. But the decisive argument was not words, but numbers. In hospitals where Joseph Lister was chief surgeon, mortality after operations fell from almost 50% to less than 10%. In some cases, to 0%. Open fractures, a 100% death sentence, now healed. Amputations, which had previously been the only salvation from inevitable gangrene, became rare. These facts, these thousands of saved lives, spoke louder than any ridicule. Doctors from all over the world began to come to Glasgow, then Edinburgh, to see it with their own eyes. They stood in Lister's operating room, observing his every movement. They saw how he meticulously treated wounds, how he changed dressings, how his patients, against all expectations, survived. They returned to their countries, shaken, and began to apply his methods. At first it was a few, then dozens, then hundreds. And everywhere antisepsis was introduced, the mortality curve relentlessly crept downwards. In 1876, Lister traveled to America, to the International Medical Congress in Philadelphia. He spoke before thousands of doctors and demonstrated his results. The audience was divided. Skeptics continued to point to the burning sensation from carbolic acid, to its aggressiveness. But Lister's supporters, who already had their own experience of successful operations, defended him. Doctors who had previously lost almost all patients with open fractures could now boast dozens of survivors. This was the first loud challenge. 5 years later, in 1881, he returned to London to the same International Medical Congress. But now he was not an outcast, but the chairman of the surgical section. This time there was no booing, no ridicule. He was met as a hero. At the culmination of the event, he performed a demonstration surgery. In a vast hall before thousands of the world's leading surgeons, he removed a tumor from a patient using his antiseptic technique. Every instrument, every dressing, the surgeon's hands, everything was treated. The patient did not die from sepsis. He recovered. This was not merely a medical report, it was a triumph. The relentless numbers, the thousands of saved lives, the personal testimonies of doctors who had themselves become convinced of his correctness, broke the resistance. Great surgeons who had called him a charlatan just yesterday now bowed their heads. The Royal Society, which had long ignored him, recognized his merits. He was elected a member of the Royal Society, then its president. In 1883, Queen Victoria bestowed upon him the title of baronet. He became Sir Joseph Lister. From a despised upstart, he transformed into a national hero, an undisputed authority. His methods, once considered madness, became the gold standard. The smell of carbolic acid, once so hated, now signified hope. He didn't just change individual procedures. He revolutionized the very principle of surgery, transforming it from a deadly lottery into a science capable of saving lives. This was a victory not of a lone genius, but of facts over dogma, persistence over ignorance, and ultimately, life over death. Lister's victory was a triumph of medicine. But long before his discoveries, before the advent of antisepsis, humanity fought another battle. A battle not with invisible microbes, but with the relentless elements. In the mid-18th century, London lived under the constant threat of the Thames. The river, the city's lifeline, was also its ruthless executioner. Annually, hundreds of people met their death in its waters. Drowning was a common end, and no one believed in the possibility of rescue. Medical knowledge of resuscitation was absent. Society was paralyzed by fear and fatalism. But even in this world of hopelessness, there were those who refused to accept death as a given. In 1774, 2 London physicians, William Hawes and Thomas Cogan, could no longer bear to see bodies pulled from the river. They were not content with fatalism. They were tormented by their powerlessness. They knew that common methods, hanging victims upside down or rolling them over a barrel, were useless and sometimes even deadly. These two were not geniuses struck by a sudden idea. They were practitioners, confronting horror every day. And they began to act, relying on intuition, observation, and common sense. Their methods were primitive but revolutionary for the time. They proposed immediately removing the body from the water, clearing the airways, then applying artificial respiration, then called mouth-to-mouth breathing. They insisted on warming the body, rubbing it, and using stimulants, from tobacco smoke administered via enema, a method later deemed harmful and discontinued, to brandy. The main thing was not to give up. To continue resuscitation efforts for several hours, even if the person appeared dead. They created the first protocols for pre-hospital care, which, despite their naivety, were a step from fatalism towards active intervention. To ensure their efforts were not isolated, Hawes and Cogan didn't just save lives themselves. They joined forces, establishing in that same year, 1774, the Society for the Recovery of Persons Apparently Drowned. It later became known as the Royal Humane Society. This was not merely a charitable gathering, it was the first systematized attempt to combat death by drowning. The society opened special rescue houses along the Thames, where necessary equipment was stored, stretchers, blankets, and warming aids. They trained volunteers, distributed instructions, and paid rewards to those who successfully saved lives. This was not an abstract theory, but a clear, measurable system. The results were immediate. In the Society's first year of operation, out of 27 recorded resuscitation attempts, 14 people were successfully brought back to life. This was a statistic that astonished skeptics. Within the first 10 years of the Society's work, over 300 people were saved. By the beginning of the 19th century, this figure exceeded 1,000. Drowning mortality in London began to decline significantly. These were not just numbers. These were saved fathers, mothers, children. The success of the Humane Society became a model for the entire world. Similar organizations began to appear in other countries, in France, Germany, the USA, and Russia. Resuscitation methods improved, but the principle remained unchanged, fighting for every life, even when hope is lost. What began as a desperate initiative by two doctors on the banks of the Thames became a global movement. It proved human life is priceless, and it is worth fighting for. And it was this spirit, the spirit of an indomitable struggle for life, that 150 years later echoed in the poetry of Alexander Bloch, becoming a symbol of hope and victory over the abyss. The stories of the Royal Humane Society and Joseph Lister are not merely chapters in a textbook. They are living proof that the greatest breakthroughs are born not from armchair insights, but from acute, agonizing necessity. They emerged from chaos, from despair, from thousands of deaths that could not be ignored. The paradox of progress is that it often begins with the most primitive, even naive actions, dictated not by theory, but by deep pain and the desire to alleviate it. It is a lesson in perseverance. Never give up. Observe, verify, share, despite ridicule and resistance. It is a lesson in collective will. When individuals refuse to accept the commonplace of death, they can spark a chain reaction that spans continents. And it is a lesson in faith, faith in evidence, in life, in the possibility of defeating even the invisible, transforming a cry of despair into a hymn of salvation. This is how humanity reclaims every inch from the abyss, step by step.